Well, g'day guys, welcome to week number 20 of our Chronological Bible Reading Plan. We are well and truly deep into the life of David. Got another week or two left as we finish our focus on King David. Last week we read about the drama that came about through his affair, or whatever we call it, with Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, and the birth of Solomon. What was very much a private issue became very public, and whether that's because David was a public figure or whether that was because he lived in a culture that traded very heavily on shame, on shaming, on guilt and shame and dishonor and honor. We saw that theme last week of dishonor and honor come out through our readings quite a lot. Either way, what was very much was a personal issue to begin with became very public and affected a lot of people. Well, guess what? This week, it just gets worse. We're going to see more drama in the life of David, more drama in his personal family life that then translates and ends up almost having a civil war in the entire kingdom that he leads. So that's the big story of what we're going to be reading this week. This week we're reading 9 chapters of 2 Samuel, 13 to 21, and we're also reading 20 Psalms, 19 of which, almost all, of which are written by David and describe the great emotion that this drama this week goes through. All right, so I don't want to give too much away, but here we go. I want to get your head in the right space as we approach the readings this week. The main thing we really need to know and be reminded of before we head into this week's readings is the complexity of David's family life. At this point in history, get this, David has at least 8 wives. At least. The first one was Michal, Saul's daughter. You remember King Saul said, hey, whoever kills Goliath can have my daughter. All right, and then he said to David, well, if you really want Michal, you need to kill 100 Philistines and bring their foreskins to me. Okay, so that he married Michal out of that, and although she got shifted to another husband when David was on the run, David ends up taking her back, and he is wife number 1. 2 Samuel chapter 3, we read a few weeks ago. It tells us that David, after her, had another 6 wives, and he had various kids through them, and they sort of came to David around the time when he was on the run from Saul and ending up starting to build his kingdom. And then last week, of course, we saw him marry Bathsheba after when King Solomon was born. So that is 8 wives, and guess what? He might have even had more, because 2 Samuel chapter 5 tells us that when he was in Jerusalem, he acquired more wives. Not only that, but he's got a bunch of concubines. Now, this is just a recipe for disaster, okay? And guess what? The other thing is, it is in direct violation of the warning that Moses gave hundreds of years earlier in Deuteronomy chapter 17, when God's people were about to go into the promised land, and he prophesied over them and said, guys, listen, in the future, one day you're going to ask for a king. But that king needs to make sure he does not take many wives for himself, or it will not go well for him. And guess what? David does not heed that advice. And so we end up with the drama that we are going to see this week. Essentially what we see this week is a drama, as I keep saying, between 2 of David's sons, okay? They're brothers, or they're half-brothers. And one of them, tragically, terribly, ends up raping, or strategizes on raping one of his half-sisters. The brother of the sister finds out about this. His name is Absalom, and as you would expect, he is absolutely furious and wants to destroy that half-brother. David finds out about this. He knows this has gone on, and yet he does nothing. He says nothing. It's like he puts his head in the sand and completely ignores the situation. His own daughter was raped. His own son had done it, and yet David does nothing. And of course, what this does over the years, as you'd understand, is it just pours fuel onto Absalom's fire, and he ends up taking matters into his own hands. He avenges his sister's rape. And then ultimately what he does is he schemes to bring David down. So rooted is the bitterness in his heart that he works out a way he schemes his way into betraying his own father and trying to snatch the kingdom from him. And so this family issue, okay, ends up almost having a civil war where David ends up running for his life from Absalom and his friends, and this war breaks out between David and Absalom. And while this war breaks out between David and Absalom, another war rears its head where followers of King Saul think, well, this is our opportunity. Let us try to take the throne from David. So David's just getting it now from both sides. The point, of course, and the lesson in this is that the micro affected the macro, okay? What David did not contain well in his own family affected very much his jurisdiction as a leader. And there's many lessons in fathering and parenting and confrontation and critical conversations that can come about through this week's reading. So I trust that you read it well and learn some of those lessons. Betrayal, of course, is something that's not new to David. You remember that betrayal, that David was betrayed often by King Saul, by someone who said that he loved him, his own son-in-law, okay, and then would regularly and consistently betray him. But, I just couldn't help thinking this week that these issues of betrayal, these two examples, are quite different. Because when it came to Saul's betrayal, David really had nothing to do with that. His heart was innocent. He was consistently doing the right thing by King Saul. And it's almost like he couldn't help that situation get better. It was really King Saul's issue. But I can't help thinking this week, as I read about the betrayal of Absalom, that David could have avoided a lot of the sting of that. And he could have avoided a lot of the severity of that had he have just had an honest conversation with his family. And so while he goes through a similar challenge, I believe the wisdom in this story is that it is something that could have been avoided. And I also wonder whether, again, we see the power of shame and the power of wanting to keep face, all right, that stopped David from interacting well with his sons and therefore allowing this war to break out. But at the end of the day, what happens is that David, despite all the war, Absalom against him and the house of Saul, still followers of Saul and Benjamites coming out against him, amongst all of that, David still retains his throne and still lives in Jerusalem in the palace, because at the end of the day, God ultimately is the one in charge of the kingdom. Okay, and God will not allow anyone to usurp the throne unless he first says so, like he did with King Saul. All right, but nevertheless, David suffers a great deal of collateral damage, both physical pain, politically he suffers, and definitely emotionally. This tears David apart. And that is where the Psalms come in this week and really shine for us, because a lot of that pain comes out in David's song. So you'll be happy to know this week that 19 out of the 20 Psalms we're going to be reading are written by David, and they all seem to match, okay, the story that we're reading. So this actually works really, really well this week, reading the drama in Samuel and then the Psalms that David writes. And I want you to keep your eye out for key words that David uses this week that speaks about Absalom and speaks about the usurping of his throne by the other people of Saul's family. He speaks about evildoers ambushing him, those he once trusted and close to him betraying his trust. He talks about them scheming downfall, lying, tricking, deceiving, speaking good with their mouths, but devising evil plans in their hearts. All these words come out in the Psalms this week. And of course, through it all, despite all the suffering that David goes through and all the emotional heartache, almost all of the Psalms finish with him declaring his trust and his praise in God. And so this is probably a good place, and I'll finish with this. This is probably a good place for me to talk a little bit to you about the book of Psalms and putting the book of Psalms in its context. Okay, so here again is the big picture when it comes to the book of Psalms. Essentially, the Psalms was collated over many, many years of Hebrew and Jewish editing, okay? And it was divided into 5 main books and 5 main sections. One of the theories of that is that maybe because Moses' books, the Torah, was one book, but written in 5 or divided into 5, okay? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Maybe that's why the Hebrew authors took the book of Psalms, 150, and they divided them into 5. That's just a theory, we're not sure of that, but it's basically the same thing. The word Psalms comes from the Greek word. The word in the Hebrew literally means praises, okay? So you could also call it the book of praises. There's 150 all up, as I just mentioned. About half of them are written by David. Okay, about a third of them are written by unknown people. We don't know exactly who wrote them, and the rest are written by guys like the sons of Korah and Asaph, etc. You're going to see their names this week. About a third of the Psalms are directed, and you'll see this in the little editorial notes, they're directed to somebody called the director of music, which basically tells us that that psalm for sure had musical accompaniment to it. So it had instruments that played with it. And in fact, every now and again, when you see the beginning of a psalm, you will also see that it says to the tune of something. So it even mentions the song name or the music, the name of the music that goes with those particular words. So while not all of the Psalms may have been sung, some of them may just be poetry, we know that a good portion of them had music written to them. The most common form of Psalms, there's basically two really common forms, and it's the songs of praise and songs of lament. Okay, so basically happy, sad. Happy, and you see a lot of the sad ones this week. They're lamenting psalms, okay? Songs of praise or songs of thanksgiving and songs of lament. Over a third of them are songs of praise. Over a third of the psalms are songs of lament. And both of them can be either individual, so the individual is crying out to God, or the individual is saying something like, I praise you. And some of them are collective, so they're written for a congregation. So it's not as common in the laments. Most of the laments are very personal, as you'll see this week, but every now and again you'll come across one where the nation or a community of people laments because of how the status of their nation as a whole. Okay, so they're both communal and individual. And of course, then there's other psalms, as I've mentioned before, that have a lot of historical recall in them, that are prophetic or petitioning or prophesy or prayers, etc., etc. And this comes into the New Testament, where Ephesians tells us to sing to one another with all kinds of hymns and all kinds of psalms. Lastly, typically the psalms, like our form of poetry today, use language, okay, the genre of the Psalms very much uses language that is highly emotional and therefore often very exaggerated or metaphoric, okay, illustrative language. And so we need to be careful at times not to take every word of the Psalms as meaning something literal, okay? This week you're going to read about God taking people under his wings. Now, that doesn't literally mean that God's a bird, okay, and that God has wings. It's a metaphor. It's an image of talking that Jesus himself later borrowed about God bringing people close to himself. So we aren't supposed to take every word literally, because that's the nature of poetry. It is metaphoric. But the one different thing about poetry in the ancient Near Eastern poetry today is often our poetry in English, we use poetry to rhyme. Well, they didn't really do that much in the ancient Near East, but one of the things they often do is they use repetition or parallelism in their poetry. So you especially notice this in the opening verses of some Psalms, where he'll say one thing and then basically repeat it with slightly different language or a different metaphor, saying the one thing but saying it twice, or sometimes even 3 or 4 times. He'll keep repeating something, all right? So that's called parallelism. It's part of the ancient Near Eastern form of poetry. So I hope that helps a little, just to give you an idea, the big picture of the book of Psalms, but also some specific things to look out for. Okay, guys? Enjoy your drama this week. Don't let it depress you, okay? It's like Days of Our Lives. It's like reading a soap opera, honestly. So get what you can out of it. I trust Holy Spirit speaks to you this week, and particularly you enjoy the Psalms as well. Bless you lots, and I'll see you next week, where I think we finish off our focus on David, and particularly, I know we're going to finish off the book of Samuel, but not yet. Just read those 9 chapters. Bless you lots, and see you later. Bye.